we have found more dialogues with policymakers and tech community, and even within the UN. And linked to the as Fabricio said, it's interesting how these interactions have been strengthened. Also, our discussions and our approach with other relevant stakeholders, with private sector, with civil society, with academia. At the national level, just let me put on the table this, at the national level, these processes have encouraged us, governments, to get more discussions, more dialogues with those sectors in order to consolidate national positions. This kind of discussions and continuous involvement of different sectors have not been seen in the form that we have recently. Then, taking into consideration these positive results from the ongoing processes, I have to say that I am confident to get results, to get important results. Let me briefly share why I am being optimistic. It's not only being optimistic for being optimistic, but why. In this regard, it's important to me to identify that many concrete proposals have been already put on the table of both the open-ended working group and the GDE, from repositories, international repositories of experiences or implementation guidelines, to a program of action or mechanisms to follow up the implementation of norms and previously agreements, such as the one presented by Australia and Mexico with many other countries. So we have on the table these very substantive and concrete proposals. Then something is going to happen with them. Discussions in both levels, the reduced 25 GDE or the open-ended working group, have allowed us also to identify the strong link between international law, norms, CDMs, and capacity building. For instance, as Fabricio said, even considering that we are having a first committee discussion, international security discussions, it is now clear the coherence of this with advancing the 2030 agenda, for instance. Also, we have seen many issues important, like gender issues or access, the universal access, etc., and the importance of bridging the gaps, even when having these first committee or international security discussions. So, of course, core questions and differences on international law applicability we are facing, but we have now many voices that we believe we can push for having responses. Thank you, Brad.
Okay, I think it's probably good to start. It's very difficult to have a panel in 2020 without discussing the global pandemic and the coronavirus. I think the impact of COVID-19, I think, is not just physical. I mean, it's completely changed the way that we interact with the digital world, and we have a lot of us working from home and studying online, connecting through social media more than we ever have before. I think what's really relevant, though, is that these aren't necessarily just temporary changes. For a lot of people, it's going to be a consistent shift. Like, this is the new normal of operation. And with that, an increasing reliance on cyberspace. I also think what comes with that, though, is a changing nature of conflict in cyberspace as well. And Roman, I'll start with you on this. How has the pandemic impacted digital rights as more people everywhere rely on digital infrastructure in an effort not to spread this disease?
Thank you, Raj, and that's an excellent question. So my job at Access, in addition to looking at the Asia-Pacific region, is to help coordinate our global cybersecurity policy. And what I see is interesting because there's the policy impact of government developments responding to the pandemic, and often, as unfortunately is perhaps far too often the case, well-meaning responses that actually result in harms to rights, but also sometimes governments using the excuse of the pandemic to move fast and break things, which also have an impact on digital rights. But beyond that, as you mentioned, there's the very simple fact that digital is everywhere. It's not a separate activity. Everything you do impacts digital rights. As I put it, Access Now as an organization, we originally called ourselves a digital rights organization. And we actually explicitly said now nearly 3 years ago, we are a human rights organization in the digital age, along with many other colleagues in this space. and the sort of digital security work we provide. I'm a public policy person, but the real heroes in the organization are the people who work with our digital security helpline, a free service that any civil society member, activist, transparency whistleblower, journalist can use globally, where they get free assistance, proactive or reactive. And what's been striking is the amount of increased activity they've had to see during the pandemic. In April, just soon after the lockdowns, they saw that month was our busiest period for the helpline in its existence. And I think, that's not the only benchmark. After that, several months have been the busiest in our existence, which shows you that digital security is critical to what everyone is seeing globally, particularly civil society actors. What's happening is they are facing newer issues and threats. Let me put it this way. For example, for a digital security organization to look, rather a rights organization, to look at human rights issues, they would normally be able to meet lawmakers easily, hold a press conference that's nearly all virtual or at least increasingly digital now. And all of that stuff requires them to be more careful about what they put out. They are targeted sometimes by nefarious actors, from criminals to, unfortunately, sometimes even government actors. That is the truth that needs to be said. And they are increasingly having to deal with this with limited resources, incredible strain, incredible mental anguish and challenges during this period. And what we've seen, therefore, is an increased need for digital security. We provide that. Many other organizations also do. We're not the only one. We're, in fact, very proud to be members of CiviCert, the Civil Society Computer Emergency Response Team network. And the fact that a network like that exists shows you that global civil society, the watchdogs who often protect our democracies and protect our governments globally, they need to secure themselves. And what I want to mention is we have heard about the fact that, for example, healthcare has been targeted during the pandemic, and that's a simple cybersecurity reality. But activists are being targeted, journalists are facing issues. They're also facing issues because they're often talking about digital law abuse during this period. For example, sometimes coronavirus tracking programs being used to actually conduct surveillance. Fake news laws being used to not suppress fake news on the coronavirus, but actually being used to target free speech and expression. And you're also seeing, unfortunately, sometimes the passing of negative cybersecurity laws by national governments saying they're going to improve cybersecurity, but actually being used to target not just activists, but security researchers. And I wanted to leave that fact with you. What's striking to me is the very people we need to depend on more, the humans who make human-centric cybersecurity and human rights, rather a more secured human rights community globally possible at this day. Security researchers, independent whistleblowers who discover vulnerabilities in software, they are sometimes being targeted due to either badly crafted laws or laws that are deliberately crafted in a way to be able to target these people. So in addition to providing better digital security, we need to understand that cybersecurity discussions at the national level, we need to connect the two. The technical community and the human rights community are not separate. You need to connect the two together, and not enough of that is happening today.
Thank you, Raman.
Maybe if I could add to that just for a second.
Yeah,
please. I agree with everything that he just said. I think that's all absolutely right. And I think, the two things that have struck me as being particularly of note is, one, that as we become more dependent on these technologies, we have seen criminal states and others attacking them, and that's been an unfortunate thing. I think it's a recognition of cybersecurity being more important. But two, goes back to something that Isaac was saying too. As important as these processes in New York have been, I think one of the challenges is that cybersecurity is still seen as this boutique issue, this kind of not that important issue that the experts can deal with. Like most of the people on this call are people who do this all the time. So we talk to each other, but we really need to convince the high level political leadership of countries that this is a real priority and they need to deal with it. And I think to the extent there's any silver lining from the COVID crisis, I think the fact that there's greater recognition, including in developing countries, that this is something that was really important, that it's not just digitization, but it's also protecting cybersecurity and how we might be able to get there.
I guess to the rest of the panel, do you think this has created, a greater urgency or a need to protect vulnerable institutions from cyber attacks? Kai, if I can bring you in here.
I had to unmute myself. I think I would agree with what Chris just said. I think for sure it has really focused the minds in terms of, governments around the world are I think realizing a little bit more what critical infrastructures are and how connected everything is, which maybe like is shifting a little bit the perception of what is critical. As you know, the last 6 months, or I guess more now, we've all sort of started working online. Schooling is increasingly online, and obviously the attacks on healthcare, as Roman has mentioned, have been really prominent. I think, in fact, today, Microsoft, just like an hour ago maybe, Microsoft just published a blog highlighting the attacks from state-associated entities against healthcare institutions' vaccine research, and that that has been a theme, I will say, in the last 6 months. Right? There's been others who've called this out as particularly problematic. We've seen hospitals close down in the middle of pandemic and things like that. And while I totally agree with Raj, I think it's with Roman, which is like it shouldn't be the only lens we look through it, but it is that moment in time where governments are much more focused on okay, this actually needs to work. But I would also completely agree with Roman. I think we've seen over the past couple of years the extension of particularly state actors that are like we originally looked at, how do we protect the parties and electoral processes within our Defending Democracy program since sort of the last election in the US, so 2016. And a service that we offered to those entities have increasingly expanded in the last few years, as we realized it's much more like the think tank community around it, the human rights activists around it, the journalists around it. So there's definitely something that both sides of the argument, both the attacks against critical, like actual attacks that bring things down, and also attacks that effectively are surveillance or just trying to understand and find data that could be used against particular individuals, have to be kept in mind. So I think it is a good time to focus the mind, but it's also a good time to be vigilant.
Fantastic. I think we've all touched on like the necessity for health institutions and research institutions to be, I guess, safeguarded during like a health crisis. Do you think there are sufficient protections currently in place? And if not, why not? That's an open question to anyone on the panel.
I mean, I'd say no. I think it's just recently become more of a priority when folks understand. I'll quote one of the former president of Estonia, Thomas Ilves, who always talks about the worries he has in cyberspace, and one of them is the integrity of information. That he cares if there's a denial of service attack, but if someone actually breaks in to your hospital and changes your blood type, so the next time you get a transfusion you die, that's more serious. So that could be one of the challenges we have going forward. And I think if you look back at the WannaCry worm and how that affected the UK's health system, part of the reason is that often health systems and hospitals don't have the budget or the expertise to deal with this. And we really need to treat them as an additional critical infrastructure if we're not already.
Maybe if I quickly add one more thing, I think the thing to just keep in mind as well is we're looking at the globe at this stage as there's the varying levels of connectivity, but and as a result, there's also varying levels of sort of advanced technologies being used, and so so making sure that we not only look at the tech and sort of see how protected it is. And I would agree with Chris there. I think there's definitely more to be done, but there's also definitely a human element there. Ensuring that the humans who use these technologies are aware and know how to act securely. I think that's where a lot still has to be done. Discussions and efforts and things that Chris is leading in the GFCE around capacity building are critical components in getting us all to a better place.
Yeah. Fabrizio, do you have a pen up there?
Thank you. One thing I've learned, when the pandemic is over, that day, all of us will know how to use the unmute button. But no, I just would plead that we try and understand the security in a broader, have a broader understanding of the security threats that go with cyber. I mean, there's a lot of focus on protecting the physical integrity of our systems, which is tremendously important. But there are other aspects that have come to the fore under COVID that need equal attention. Misinformation diffused on a scale never seen before, never permitted when we were limited to non-digital media, caused deaths. That's a security issue. Fueling of exclusion, political violence, prejudice, hate causes deaths. That's a digital security issue. And then finally, the issue of not being connected against the backdrop of a pandemic. The unconnected in an ever more digitized world aren't foregoing a luxury. They are foregoing everything that makes the first world move and will be left ever further behind. That is also a security issue because there's a World Bank UN study on this called Pathways to Peace that analyzes, documents that the biggest creator of conflict, biggest creator of violence is exclusion, inequality, marginalization. So security, I think we have to think of in a much more multi-tiered, comprehensive way, and not as important as that is. I'm not saying it's important. As important as it is, not think of it only through the lens of protecting our digital systems. It's also about the insecurity that is inherent to the sort of anarchy that is privileged in the digital world.
Yeah, I think one key takeaway for someone like me who's just digesting all of that is like this isn't a simple one solution fix. Like there are so many nuances that require multiple voices from multiple stakeholders, which neatly leads us into I guess the crux of this discussion. So turning back to the UN dialogues, I want to focus on what degree they have included necessary multi-stakeholder input and what the multi-stakeholder community is hoping they will achieve. So I guess more specifically for Chris, Kaya, and Raman, from more of an outsider perspective, what are the impressions of the broader multi-stakeholder community when it comes to these discussions at the UN? We'll start with Kaya.
Sure. I feel I always have things to say. No, I think, and that's also a question in one of the questions in the chat, I think, which is, making sure that we are able to open up this discussion to a broader audience would be incredibly helpful. I think, from a private sector tech company perspective, obviously these discussions impact us directly. While there are discussions around state security, it is a reality today that a lot of the infrastructure and technology is operated by the private sector. And I think we are able to both provide hopefully helpful input into those discussions in terms of how some of the technologies work, how they interrelate, what is the future trajectory, as well as what are some of the threats that happen today that we are seeing on our systems effectively. And I think from that perspective are also hopefully able to I would almost say help shape solutions in this space. And so, when the last year in December, the only, I guess, multi-stakeholder consultation happened between within the context of the open-ended working group. I think that was a great opportunity. And we'd love to see more of that, more of a conversation between the private sector and governments on some of these issues. Some of the governments really, would want to call out Australia, Canada, in particular in this regard, and Netherlands, in particularly Mexico, sorry, as well. Really proactively reach out and consult. But I think it'd be good if this was a more formal opportunity for everybody to kind of be allowed to pick each other's brains, I think. I also have views on civil society, but I'll probably ask Roman to talk about this.
So I'm happy to rise to that, bait and to say, and it's an interesting challenge engaging in the multilateral processes. And I'd say this from a perspective of an organization, which is probably not so much always on the outside, a little bit inside, because we are formally ECOSOC accredited. We have accreditation with the UN ECOSOC, but even there, we find it challenging, particularly with the open-ended working group. And the pandemic's actually made it harder. It's very hard, and I'll talk about that concretely, but just, perspective, what we bring is the fact that, one, obviously we are in a sense, a cybersecurity provider. We provide security to civil society, journalists, and other groups internationally. We're a user because we have to protect our own systems and networks, along with many other civil society groups. And we're also an advocate. We have particular points of view. And I'd say we also perform the job, or civil society more broadly performs the job, of speaking truth to power. That can be irritating, but it's also incredibly useful to be there. And that's the first job of a good policy analyst, is to essentially speak truth to power on some of these issues. And the challenge with the UN processes has been, despite the individual attempts, Kaya mentioned, Isaac is fantastic, many others as well, but I know they all also individually have mentioned, it is really challenging because you want it to be useful and effective, and to get states to agree to talk about stuff that they're not always happy to, and there are disagreements between states. I've been accused of being an optimist over the processes, and I'd probably say I'm still that. I've seen the value in these conversations, sometimes more so than individual states might be there. But the reality is, for the technical community, the people who deploy cybersecurity or do cyber day in, day out, it's actually very hard for them to engage, even if they have regular engagement in the UN system. They can't easily take part. They can't provide papers. It's a challenging process to make views available. You have to spend disproportionately on people who are either based in New York or Geneva, who can talk to people there physically, meet them. And even for a group like us, with the pandemic and the restriction on physical meetings, a lot of access goes away. And people who work with us individually find that frustrating as well. So that's a reality that we should acknowledge. Why we should keep that in mind is, with some of the proposals that have passed or are being considered on refinements of these processes, whether it's the proposed 2021 restructured OEWG, the Open-Ended Working Group, or the program of action that many states from the EU to the Global South have jointly worked on, there are things that should be baked in there about talking to stakeholders. And I'll give you an example of what I find both interesting but also a perversion. We are a member of the Forum for Incident Response, along with many governments and corporations. And they are the B group you go and talk to on cybersecurity, providing dispassionate advice across lines. For us, it's even very funny that as a first member, we can participate in a limited way because we have ECOSOC status. First itself cannot speak and has to come as either part of our delegation or others. And that's the example of why we should try and fix this. Not necessarily always just because we want it to be democratic, and I do believe we should, but there are incredibly useful perspectives that these groups bring, and there are ways we could improve that perhaps.
Yeah, and I'd say, just on the first comment especially, there's this disconnect between the communities that some of the actions in the UN are trying to protect and those communities. So for instance, in the GGE back in 2015, one of the agreed norms was not attacking CSIRTs because they're like the hospitals or the ambulances of the internet. And I gave a keynote to the first conference in Malaysia a couple of years ago, and I talked about this. And almost no one in the audience had ever heard of that, which is strikingly bad. We need to make sure that there's a connection between these technical communities and other communities and what's going on in the UN. And as much as we celebrated the December meeting, and it was a great breakthrough for the UN, it still was just a small piece of advance. I mean, the fact is, if you were at that meeting, everyone read their statements on both sides, and that was pretty much it. So what you really need is a better chance for interaction, for meaningful interaction. Kaya mentioned some of the governments who brought who made it their point to assemble stakeholders and talk to them before they go into these negotiations. That would be great. And we know some countries aren't going to do that at all. But if we can find a way to have more meaningful interaction, I think that makes a difference. And look, I think there's been progress, but not nearly enough.
Chris, you mentioned like making progress. I just want to press you a little. Do you feel like the dialogues reflect the input of the private sector and civil society?
I think to some extent, to the extent that countries are actually bringing that perspective in. Look, we're, the GFC, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, we have and will submit comments to the OEWG as they go through. How much weight those comments have, hard to tell, right? The players who have the most weight are going to be the nation states, because that's what the UN is organized around. So I do think it's important for us to have some more meaningful input. They could ignore that input. There's going to be debates between countries too, but if there's a way to get that input there, that just helps the whole process.
I was going to just jump in very briefly to say that that's one important reason for more discussions around this, because it is a political process. There are decisions and consensus to be achieved across states, and for them to buy into it. A lot of it's also just implementation. And the more people beyond just us talk about this and take that discussion to actual national discussions about, by the way, what is your cyber coordinator talking or saying about this? What is the UN, what is the mission saying about this? These are important things, but even the cybersecurity communities within countries need to discuss it more. I was struck by once hearing someone who's fairly senior in the EU world who didn't fully know what all EU states were saying, not because the EU doesn't try to do a fantastic job of it. There's so much going on that we need to take it there. And for me, it is very important to look at the UN discussions because it's happening, it is constructive, it's at least not a complete breakdown of things, which means you need to have more discussion and buy-in, and even perhaps a sharpening of positions in national capitals, because sometimes states aren't sure what their positions are, and it's fine for them to create them, but we need to acknowledge that they need help.
Yeah, I just maybe add one other thing. One thing that I think has been really effective is a sort of traveling roadshow of ambassadors Lauber and Patriota going to various forums. In fact, they came to the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise meeting in Addis Ababa back last November. And I think just having those listening sessions where they know what's going on, they're talking to the community, they've been very dedicated to that. So I think that's been very helpful. And as I, anticipating maybe Raj, your next question, since I think it's coming up on terms of what the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise really expects or hopes to get from these processes. I do think, and I was heartened to see when I participated in some of these meetings, particularly the OEWG, the number of countries who raise capacity building is a core issue for them, a foundational issue for them, and it really is. And also the number of countries who mentioned the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, and I think that was very heartening too. We did our launch of our new foundation in New York in February alongside the OEWG meeting, so it's important to have that community understand it. So I'd like to see, some emphasis on capacity building, especially as we talked a little bit before, having capacity building for cyber not being seen as a separate thing, but being integrated into the UN development goals. I think that's really important because, again, it doesn't make it this outlier, this little boutique thing, but something that's core to everything we're doing. An exhortation for countries to prioritize this, both donor countries and countries who need help. But what I'd like not to see is the UN trying to say, we have this, we're going to do it all. We're going to be the ringleader of all this, come to us and we're the hub. Because I just don't think that's going to work very well for all the reasons we talked about. First, it's just going to be states. Second, it takes a lot of resources to do this. And I hope what they would do is leverage organizations like the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise that is already working to coordinate these issues, and others as well. And I hope that's going to be the output, to be more collaborative rather than this is just going to be a UN thing.
If I can briefly add a governmental voice, just to say that actually at the international discussion, at the mandate of these processes, yes, we do have this opportunity to informal consultations or more formal consultations with relevant stakeholders. And I feel that we need to institutionalize these kind of consultations. We governments working within the UN, we need to encourage to have on the mandates from the very beginning, this call to have consultations with relevant stakeholders. But I just want to insist on the issue on this issue at the national level. It has been very encouraging for particular countries. Maybe most of the countries are in the willing to have this kind of consultations, but maybe they have not identified the correct sectors inside their countries, etc. So with these international processes, having consultations, we at the national levels, of course, are encouraged to have this kind of interactions. So I sincerely believe, and taking into account our own experience, that the international processes have encouraged us to have better consultations and better communication. Maybe not most of the time institutionalized or standardized, but it would be helpful that from the civil society, from the private sector, from the academia, to make visible those successful experiences of this kind of engagements in some concrete countries, in order we, the rest of the countries, try to accommodate to our own possibilities and our own realities.
Kaya, if I can bring you in on this one. Historically, the GGE dialogues have included only a very limited number of states. Comparatively, however, the OEWG is now open to all UN member states. From specifically a capacity building perspective, how can we make sure that all states are equipped to have a voice in this really important debate?
I think that, I think that's incredibly difficult. I think that it's, I think we sort of touched it a little bit on the panel already, but it's almost taking a look not only at the cybersecurity capacity building as a technical or domestic policy issue, but also ensuring that states are able to engage on some of these issues in a diplomatic circle. So, there's been for sure a few initiatives that the Diplo Foundation, for instance, that is an organization based out of Geneva, has run trainings for diplomats on effectively cyber diplomacy. Estonia as a country has put on a training as well. There's initiatives that the UNODA has also put forward in terms of more like interactive online experiences. And I think that is the bit that is critical, right? I think ensuring that the diplomats that engage in these discussions are able to not just necessarily report back to the capital, and then hopefully have someone there that knows what's going on, but also engage on in a meaningful debate. And I think that is just I think a thing that will take time. Partly will also take time because a lot of it's diplomacy, so people rotate, right? So even if there is a breadth and depth of knowledge that an individual could gain over a 3-4 year period, while they are the country's representative in New York or Geneva, then they rotate out and there's a new person. And oftentimes it's a new person that has never had an exposure to this. So I think fundamentally it needs to become, as with many security issues, a core part of the training for a diplomatic career.
Yeah, and I'd say I was, back in 2011, which seems like a lifetime ago now. I was the first diplomatic office dedicated to cyber issues, I think, in the world, and now there are over 40 of them, which is a great advance because it means we're treating this as not just a technical issue, but as a policy issue. But Kaya helped, co-chaired a task force in the GFC, and I should say that the members of the GFC include nation states, they include private sector, they include civil society and academia. They include even some UN institutions as well. And so it's a very inclusive group. And we were looking at how we can jumpstart this, what we can do with norms and not negotiate new ones, but help implement, help get people familiar with how they would conduct diplomacy. Putting out a number of things, including a compilation of where we are on CBMs, for instance, I thought was very helpful. So we really need to beef that up and training diplomats and others to negotiate and understand these things, even though they'll rotate through, absolutely true. But the more we have folks who are in the diplomatic corps understanding these are key issues for them going forward, and not just technical issues, but core issues of national security, of economic security, of human rights, that's going to help us all.
Isaac, Fabrizio, just like to invite you in on capacity building in the diplomatic sense. Any thoughts within cybersecurity as a broader issue? Fabrizio, I think you're...
Yeah, sorry, I think there's a real change of attitude that I've observed among diplomats. I mean, when I don't have the length of focus that all of you have on these issues, but when I started first getting involved in this domain about 4 years ago, anything cyber related was considered a job for specialists, and ambassadors in New York who consider themselves at the top of their trade, who are at the top of the trade. Many are former foreign ministers, many go on to become foreign ministers, would have considered it something technical, not worthy of their attention. I think that's changed radically already prior to COVID, and even more with COVID. I think there's a growing understanding that this is no longer a separate issue, but it affects the politics as we know it. It affects economics, development, human rights as we know it, and to remain ignorant is very dangerous. I mean, Mexico, and I have to praise Mexico. Mexico did a series of events last year with our support, basically to try and educate. I mean, you can't tell senior diplomats they need to be educated. They don't like that. But to have discussions on these issues with diplomats in New York, and they were incredibly well attended. And I see the resonance when the Secretary General launched his roadmap on digital cooperation. I think about 150, 160 states attended, and most of them at a very senior level. So I think there's been a big switch. And I think COVID has only accelerated that. But having said that, I do think we have further to go. I'd like to put it the other way. I mean, I spoke once to the head of Nokia about, he was preaching to us on the need for policymakers to understand much better how machine learning works, how AI works, and the policymakers are making big decisions but don't really understand it. And then we got him in to brief the senior managers of the UN. But I made the point at the time that that's a two-way street. Diplomats need to understand much better how technologies work, but those who are in the technological field need to understand much better how politics work, how sociology works, how human rights work. And I think there's a massive deficit, if I may say so, on that side, and a certain sort of arrogance in the sector that believes that such knowledge is not particularly necessary. And that has to change too. There has to be massive education on both sides of the divide.
And maybe if I add to, I would agree with that. I would also, to add to that, I think it's also, so it's a question of, so both on the tech sector, both understanding how the processes work, how politics work, how just government diplomacy works, right? As well as issues like human rights and ensuring that are integrated in the processes of technology development from early on. I think there's been greater awareness, but I think we're still far to go. And I think but the other thing as well is to, find a way to ensure that the tech sector is not just the 3 or 4 big players, but actually bring in a slightly broader church. And I completely understand that you'll never have the SMEs because you don't have the time, right? But ensure that you do have a slightly broader conversation, because a lot of the technology that is profoundly impactful is produced by very small companies. And in addition, that it's not just effectively companies from maybe 3 or 4 markets that are engaging in these conversations, right? I think there is a lot of American companies, there are increasingly now Chinese companies, there's maybe a Russian and 2 European, but getting an understanding of how these technologies interact in a Latin American context or in an African context, you actually need to have people who integrated and operated on the ground versus someone sort of from the West Coast of the United States.
If I can maybe like pull this a little bit more macro, moving beyond just the OEWG and the GGE, in thinking about the role the United Nations plays. Fabrizio, your office at the UN has been coordinating a series of roundtable discussions, including one focused on digital trust and security. How do you see this initiative relating to the first committee working groups, and are they overlapping or largely complementary?
I think they're completely complementary, and our process is reinforcing. The first committee processes, by definition, look at this through the lens of threats to international peace and security, and look at it in the context of interstate conflict. What we're arguing is that the issue is much broader, as I tried to stress in my initial remarks. We need to look at this from the point of view of the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to look at this from the point of view of the health of our economies. We need to look at this from the point of view of the security of our human rights. And that's the complementarity. The other complementarity is that it's meant to be a high-level declaration. And what we're trying to say is this is a political issue. This is not just an issue for experts, as wonderful as experts are, as important as they are, but we need to elevate this to a head of state level. And that is also the added value. And furthermore, this is very much meant as a multi-stakeholder process. All the discussions we've had so far have been through a multi-stakeholder process. The idea was born through a multi-stakeholder process, and we would see it advanced as a multi-stakeholder process. So it takes a much broader lens. It focuses on development and human rights. It's at a much higher level. I mean, let's be honest, how many people outside a very narrow circle of specialists know about the GGE and the open-ended working group processes, as important as they are? And the aim would also be that the global political declaration would enhance the image and the knowledge of the important work that's happened under the GGE and more recently under the OEWG. So perhaps we haven't explained this enough, but somehow I think this idea of duplication or overlap is a little strange. I mean, those who are discussing nuclear arms control in the 50s, 60s, and 70s never worried that other groups that were talking about safe standards for nuclear power plants were somehow duplicating their work. I mean, this is transformative to our world. And the idea that we can all settle it, all the issues that arise through the GGE and the open-ended working group is, to my mind, not likely to prevail.
Just to dig a little bit further, what or which organizations rather are included in the roundtable discussions?
Well, the roundtable discussions are open. So frankly, it's those who are most enthusiastic and most committed to the particular theme. We have 8 roundtables around the 8 work streams set out in the Secretary General's roadmap. Those companies, countries, civil society institutions that are particularly committed to an issue join. There's no fixed list, and the people who show up, I mean, we have a fairly constant group, but anybody's welcome at any time.
Thank you. Isaac, if I can bring you in on this next one. Cybersecurity was notably included for the first time in convenings of the Security Council in recent months. Also at the regional level, the OAS has increased attention to cybersecurity. How do you see these developments?
Thank you, Rek. Actually, let me just first to build upon what Fabrizio said. Today, when talking about cyberspace, digital environment, it's impossible. I mean, working within the relevant processes within the UN, it's impossible to see only the first committee. or to see only the second committee discussions, or the third committee, or the sixth committee. Sincerely, it's impossible. Actually, we need to be able, as diplomats and as governments, putting on the table positions, national positions, to be able to see how all these processes and efforts are linked to the very big goal of getting a cyberspace, a lawful cyberspace, and peaceful cyberspace, and open cyberspace. So I feel it's necessary, of course, to break the silos. How to do it? It's very hard to respond. But of course, this kind of multi-stakeholder, inter-regional dialogues, etc., help us to try to break those silos. Of course, I'm not saying that we need no mandates for each of the processes. I mean, first committee processes, they need an international security mandate, but the discussions, the efforts, and actually the results coming from each will have links to others. Regarding your very important question on how I see these developments of the Security Council or the OAS dealing with the cyberspace issues and cybersecurity, I see these developments as a result of two causes. Of course, the more interest on cybersecurity issues, but also, unfortunately, the increasing of cyber attacks and major incidents, not only in number, but in their negative consequences. I feel it's important, of course, that the Security Council have had already discussions on these issues. Nevertheless, it's important to identify and considering the Security Council mandates, that for me, it's not necessarily the venue to prevent or to promote commitments to prevent, but to respond or to react. Then I believe it's important, of course, to consolidate the previous step, the prevention of conflicts, ensuring the peaceful uses. And that's why I feel that through the open-ended working group, the DGE processes will have opportunities to elevate these commitments in order to advance these previous steps to the Security Council discussions. Regarding the regional level, thanks for the question, because it's important also to remember that actually the UN Charter has an 8th chapter dedicated to regional roles, to regional organization. And this is important. Mexico recently, to the OAS General Assembly just a couple of months ago, promoted within the international law resolution an affirmation that the international law, it's applicable to cyberspace. And also the norms developed by the previous GGE have been to be implemented. That maybe it's not necessarily a very big step, but sincerely, considering the role of the OAS, it's a very big step that the OAS have adopted this resolution with this call to the international law applicability to cyberspace and the norms of the GGU. Then I feel that we also at the regional level, we need to have more interaction between the technical and the policy levels, and also to see how from the CBM's work that actually we have been advanced under the leadership of the SICTE in the OAS, how we can find a way to accommodate also a work on capacity building and bridging digital divides from the regional security approach, but consolidating also the path to ensure peaceful uses.
Thank you, Isaac. I think now is a really good time to switch over to our highly engaged audience. They've been submitting questions to us, so I'm sure you'll all have some interesting responses. I'll just start with, this one comes from Wout Denetris. Is the internet truly unprecedented, or is it the speed of developments that make it different from past developments that disrupted existing structures? In other words, are there no lessons to be learned from sailing the open seas, telegraphs, trains, telephony, that we can use towards the internet? So I guess a question more about, are there lessons that we can apply to these developments? Kaya.
Yeah, so maybe I'll go, and then hopefully people can jump in, because I'm not sure I have a super profound answer. So I think my perception is it is much faster, right? I think I would definitely, if you look at the speed of how things have developed and how far we have come in the past, I'll almost say like 15 years. The 15 years ago, we were we were basically the first year of Facebook. They were like a teeny tiny small proportion of population used it. The amount of the internet usage was, I think it was probably like a third of where we are now, maybe even less. So the adoption, the development, and the transformation that's associated with it, that goes across the whole of society, I think it's very different to some of the things that sort of have gone before. I would say there are definitely lessons to be learned, and I think there's not even just lessons to be learned. I think there's rules of the road that we have, there's laws that we have that don't need to be rewritten. The international law as it is should apply. International humanitarian law, human rights law should all apply to this space. We just need to figure out what are some of the nuances and gaps that need to be addressed. So I think there's definitely, we have strong foundations. We just sometimes ignore them.
I think that last point is incredibly important. So, cyberspace does have lots of differences, to be sure, but we don't need a whole new rule set from what we've had for the last 100 years and since World War II to bring us safely into the century, or more safely than we were, at least. And if we have a whole different rule set for the internet than we do for physical space, that itself causes instability and problems. So I think it's important for us to say how the internet is really grounded in the physical world, and it is, especially with international law. As we think about rules of the road and norms, we're applying some of those precepts to more internet things, to be sure. Confidence building measures is a concept that was around long before the internet existed, but that's important in this space too. So I think there's a lot of things that are direct parallels. And if we abandon those, then we treat the internet as a free fire zone, in the sense where nothing applies, and that's very dangerous. So I think it's very important to keep us grounded in the physical world and what we've thought about in the past.
Thank you. Next question comes from Andre Berena. Despite the importance of the issues being discussed and the developments in the GGE and the OEWG, the reality is that these processes remain fairly niche, largely invisible to the general public. What else could be done to make these processes and issues more visible to a wider audience? I think I might just add a little bit something to that as well. From a youth perspective, I mean, young people are going to see the impacts of all of these discussions and these decisions moving into the future. So I think that's a really pertinent question, and one, how can we make these processes and issues more visible to a wider and potentially younger audience?
Maybe I'll start with that, just because this has been a mission of mine for years now, is to make cyber and cybersecurity not a niche issue, but one that really transcends that. We need to put it on the political agenda. Fabrizio is right. We need to make this an issue, of world leaders, of prime ministers, of national security advisors, of generals, of parliamentarians, of foreign ministers. There's been some efforts in the past to do that, like the Global Conference on Cyberspace that brought together foreign ministers and interior ministers. I thought that was very helpful. But we have to pierce this veil and not think of it. You don't have to be a nuclear engineer to understand the policy aspects of nuclear technology. You don't have to be a coder, although you should have some people in the background who know how these things work. You don't have to be a coder to understand the policy implications here. And I often talk about our cyber group as the kind of tribe of cyber, gypsies that move from place to place, and we all talk to each other again and again, and that's great. But we're not the people that need to be reached. We need to reach those higher levels, and anything we can do, and it might be high-level declarations, it may be ingraining ourselves in these larger conferences on security, like Munich Security Conference and others that they have a cyber track, but we need that on the main stage. We need to make sure this is not just some, again, throwaway issue, but one that's core to the big discussions that are happening.
And I just wanted to add to that. It goes to some of the questions, the people you want to have positions on this. So besides world leaders, it's often with their own constituencies. What is your government's position on international cyber discussions? If you're a candidate for office, what do you think about that beyond just, and I joke as a cybersecurity person, I actually hate using the word cyber because it can mean all those different things. And as Fabrizio mentioned, it's important to understand the context of it, but sometimes it allows politicians to just hide behind an initial thing. But more often than not, if you ask them, what is your position, they will actually go to attempts to try and craft it. So we need to ask them, what is your position on some of these international discussions that are happening on cybersecurity, or even just saying, what is your position on the UN cyber processes? Simple, pithy, get that going. Even talk to local communities and these national capital conversations, because that's where often I see that disjunct between what, as Chris mentioned, the traveling community of cyber gypsies versus what people domestically might say. You talk to someone in Bangladesh on digital security, for them, their meaning is very different, far more, I'd say, directly about how a particular law might be misused versus what we might be talking about in terms of confidence building measures or vulnerability disclosures. So let's bring that there. And perhaps one more space for that is these regional meetings. The OAS has done a great job on this. Many others are also trying to do it. The African Union, has to their credit, had some very interesting, useful discussions when they've done this. Again, also supported by the great work of the OEWG chair and the GGE chair. But we need more of that. And perhaps even not just depend on the UN, perhaps we can offer as different stakeholders, why don't we have that chat at a regional level or across different stakeholders there, but have more of that. And I keep joking, people say, there's already so many discussions on cybersecurity. And I say that's not enough because you need newer people in that. People who do social policy, people who do public health, people who have other views to come in there. Because some of the things are also to connect existing issues. And as Fabrizio flagged to us, they correlate across many areas. And sometimes you can also take proactive steps. For example, on digital health, the link between digital identity, data protection, and the cybersecurity communities is tremendous, but it's very rare to find them in one room.
I would fully agree with everything that's been said. I would just add one element, and that's schools, education. I happen to have 3 teenage kids who've been in education systems because I work for the UN in 3 different countries. And they learn far more than I learned about cyber, but they learn about coding. They do learn about coding. They don't learn anything about the vulnerabilities that they're exposed to through the cyber world. They don't learn anything about how this is changing politics as we know it. They don't learn anything about what can and can't do to enhance or threaten human rights. So I think when I learned about nuclear technologies at school, I did not learn about how to become a nuclear engineer. I learned much more about nuclear in the context of geopolitics, in the context of transformation of economies. So something's gone wrong there. I'm not saying they shouldn't learn to be coders, but it shouldn't stop there. It should be much more about the societal implications across the board, and in particular on the many levels of security.
Fabrizio, that's a really good point. Yep, Isaac, please jump in.
Sorry, thank you. Just to add briefly, actually, I feel that we are facing, to the cyberspace discussions from the international security perspective. Actually, we are facing what most of the international security and peace and security issues sometimes face to the public. That is, they are not necessarily, from the very first view, they are not necessarily related to day by day, to the reality day by day. Nevertheless, it's important we, governments, private sector, civil society, and academia to work together in international organizations, of course, in order to translate to the public, to the general public, that those issues are related also to the day-by-day reality. Because as much as we ensure the peaceful uses, we will have this day-by-day reality also in a more safe and peace environment. I feel that, for instance, Unidir has been doing great job in order to disseminate, in order to spread the knowledge, but to a more specialized, that is the role, of course, but to a more specialized audience. It would be important to launch from the GFCE, for instance, or from the Cyber Peace Institute. I'm not sending the message to Chris and Kaya to do it, but maybe from those platforms to spread, to not necessarily specialized, but to the general public what it has been doing. Of course, at the regional level, we have a lot to do, and also at the national level. These kind of discussions, they are improving our way to disseminate what we are doing and what we are discussing. But also at the national level, we, as governments, we are obligated to do this kind of discussions also at the national level with the relevant stakeholder in order to spread the work what we are doing and we are trying to solve. And finally, just we depend also on the possibility to get results, to get commitments and agreement. Because if we say, oh, we do have this very interesting process of the open-ended working group and a GGE and the digital agenda, etc., but we reach no agreement, we reach no substantive commitment, then it's unnecessary to the public to know that we do have these processes.
And maybe if I can just add to this, because I think that was one of the questions. It was more earlier on, it was more focused on healthcare, but why these things are important. Whether you look at the UNGGV report of 2015, whether you look at the Paris call, which was mentioned earlier as well, I think all of these commitments, or even individual country statements, right, they all built a set of normative rules of behavior. So they build the idea of what is allowed, what is accepted, and what is really not. So there will always be people who break those rules. That it happens in every sphere of existence. There will always be people who break the rules, but the vast majority won't. If there's clarity, I think it kind of brings the bottom up, and we can all strive to do a little bit better. So I think that's why it's important. The point that Isaac just made is critical.
Yeah. Next, actually, well, just in the interest of time, trying to make sure I'm on top of it, I want to get through some of these questions because there are some excellent questions here. If I can just ask for some rapid responses, just so we can get through all of the ones that we have. Fabrizio, something that you mentioned just a quick second ago was looking at schools and education. Our next question sort of looks at the manifestation of how we can actually help them. So Ivan Bosa asks, journalists, secondary schools, education institutions, and marginalized communities such as refugees are new to the internet world and have limited knowledge of the internet. Do we have some simple software tools developed to protect new internet users from cyber attacks? And how can we best implement them on a wide scale to ensure their protection? Chris, if you have any thoughts on this, I can bring you in.
Yeah, I mean, this goes to an issue that I think is really important, which is, it's not just the tech companies and others that we need to reach out to. It's the sectors we're trying to protect. And I think journalists and others are often the ones that slip off the table. And so we need to make sure we're protecting them for lots of reasons. There are some tools out there. There's an organization called the Global Cyber Alliance that just put out a toolkit for protecting journalists. And I think I'd recommend people check that out. I think it's very useful. I think we need to, especially with ransomware and other attacks, do more things to protect schools. They have limited budgets as well. So there have been some technical tools that are out there. In addition, one of the parts of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise is talking about skills and education, which also talks about how we, as some folks on the call on this session have already said, how we start indoctrinating people at an earlier age to understand these are important issues. And so that's the policy part of it. But I think we have to do both of those things. But again, the global, the GCA toolkit, I think is very useful. It also incorporates some of the, what's called the Center for Internet Security Controls, a group that I've been on the board of. And I think those are helpful for folks too. So there's practical things out there. The other thing I'd say is when I was at the State Department, there was a lot of funding through the Internet Freedom Program and the Human Rights Program to protect these vulnerable communities around the world, to give grants to various groups to do that. And I imagine that's going to continue, especially in the new administration.
I just wanted to point some of you all to, if you go through the link, especially to civisearch.org, many groups there have received support from the Open Technology Fund and many other organizations as well. And they are the people often on the front lines helping the human rights community, journalists. There are many others we need to go to as well, but that's a useful set of resources. And the great thing about many of these folks is they don't mind pointing to each other's work. So they often use materials, they build incrementally, they put it out publicly on open source platforms and open copyright license terms so people can see it. So there's a great set of stuff there. We need to do much more as well, because I know, for example, in the public health space, people have been trying to get stuff out for doctors and others, translate that. But there's a great set of people there, and I encourage people to look at that and tell them how they could do it better as well.
Moving on to our next question comes from Alexander Fiona. For 20 years, global stakeholders fought to ensure that DNS issues, including DNS security, were addressed through multi-stakeholder fora like ICANN, and specifically not the UN. Why should DNS now be included in the UN cyber norms work? Doesn't this undermine previous efforts and risk the security and stability of the technical layer of the internet? Tricky question, any takers?
I can take a quick stab, but the one interesting thing is, for example, I know that most people, at least perhaps even the first committee processes, have been cautious about explicitly going into, for example, DNS as an element of this should be discussed and decided at the UN. There have been discussions or concerns from states. It's useful to even hear that, because sometimes you need to know they have a concern. It might be posturing, it might be genuine, but let it come up, because otherwise they're going to go ahead and do other things. But there's been caution, but that's why sometimes the technical community is looking at these things carefully to make sure it's effective. That doesn't necessarily mean it may not come up in another UN fora, but to my knowledge, it's not come up so explicitly here. But again, Isaac, Chris, and Kaya may have seen something that I missed.
I doubt you're going to get any consensus in the UN processes to try to take over the DNS system, and I think that'd be a bad idea. I think the way that's been built, the multi-stakeholder system, is good. Can it be improved? Sure, and it needs to be reflective of that. But I think it would be a mistake for the UN to try to, and I think this has been true for many years, to try to take over that function. We wouldn't have the internet we have today if it were done by just a government-only organization.
And maybe, go ahead, Fabrizio.
No, I just want to say, speaking for the UN in terms of the UN Secretariat, not speaking for UN member states, and there is that distinction. There's absolutely no aspiration on behalf of the UN Secretariat to take this over, notwithstanding what member states may discuss and decide, but there's no aspiration in that regard in the Secretariat.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing, and I think it's this, we kind of have gone in and out of this throughout the conversation, but I think it's important for everyone to remember that there's sort of the normative conversations, which are fair, conversations about agreements that are fairly, I'm going to say vague, even though it's probably the wrong word, commitments that states make at an international level. And then these then have to be implemented on the domestic level. So I think the difference between sort of the broad commitment and then the domestic implementation, I think it's something to keep in mind. I know this doesn't answer the DNS question, but it's something that I think is helpful for us all to think about it as we sort of continue this conversation.
But I would say the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, where I was one of the commissioners, recommended, either you can call it a new norm or really an articulation of the existing critical infrastructure norm. I think it's better to think of it that way, of protecting the global core of the internet as something that is a norm of restraint that states should not disrupt the global core of the internet, which includes things like the DNS system. So I think that's important.
Yeah, and just if I may add, when we talk about breaking silos, it's important also to see what have been successful and what have been not, in order we to engage in the processes. What I'm saying is, when calling to break the silos, we are not trying to bring the IGF to the first committee and the first committee to the third and the sixth committee, you know, or the GFCE to the first committee or something. We do have many different platforms, and some platforms, the multi-stakeholder nature, or maybe the very specialized work, they have very important merits in each of their work. So we are not. We have not to try to, to overlap the mandates. It's important to break the silos, but to have the complete picture, but not necessarily to overlap the mandates and the work that actually have been doing the different platforms and doing good. I mean, having results such as the IGF, etc.
Just on behalf of the audience and their incredible questions, I want to say thank you, Chris, Isaac, Roman, Kaya, and Fabrizio. Looking ahead, I guess, coming to the closing times of our discussion, I guess fortuitously timed, next week kicks off the next round of dialogue for the open-ended working group. I guess for the panel more broadly, what are the best ways for multi-stakeholder communities to provide comments and contributions, even if it is informally?
I thought I can just come in just to flag, especially my colleague Sheetal, who's fantastic with Global Parsing Digital, has made a couple of suggestions here. Please look at the chat. There's some fantastic things that people already mentioned, including from Andrea and Sheetal. But in addition to those, again, you can provide if you have a view, make it available. You can send it to the process, but you can also send it to states. And often, again, many of us are happy to help and coach people who want to provide more inputs there. But often they're common positions. The more people agree on common positions and put them up jointly, again, that tends to have more impact there. But there's a process as well for an informal mechanism for December, which people are working on. And again, I think that's very important to make sure is effective. And that's something that a lot of us are focusing on there. But lastly, if there's a proposal from states that people have strong views on or believe should carry forward, speak up and talk to perhaps your own national policy maker or relevant political contact, because there are agreements being made there. Some of them may go over the line. And I always recommend that if there's a good idea, a lot of people are behind, tweak it, improve it, and it will be more likely to get ahead there. But also, if there's something you're very concerned by, speak up and do that there. But again, I think many of us are happy to help people who may want to do that.
And maybe I'll just add, so the open-ended working group has a website where you get a lot of the submissions. So I'm not going to remember where it is. Oh, there you go. Someone pasted it. So there you go. Thank you, Sheetal. So, go check it out. That's where you'll see a lot of the latest, where the latest sort of discussions are. You'll also see all the submissions from both states and sort of the multi-stakeholder community more broadly. But then also, Roman sort of alluded to it, but there are things afoot in terms of the preparing a more informal consultation in December. So if you want to know more, I think email Sheetal, email me, or email Roman, and we're happy to help with that.
Yeah. Chris and Isaac, I might get your thoughts on this. Should industry and civil society organize an ongoing dialogue to contribute to these UN discussions?
I mean, I think that's one possibility. I don't think we should look at either industry or civil society as monolithic creatures, right? There are lots of different industries, the tech industry, non-tech industry. Even within the tech industry, there's a lot of diversity. And the same with civil society. So just having one big session, I'm not sure is as effective as having several small ones, perhaps. But I think we need to find new mechanisms. one thing that the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise is thinking of doing is convening a conference that's not just us, not just the GFC, but a number of these other stakeholder groups, including states, to have discussions around capacity building and some of these other issues. And we're looking to perhaps do that at the end of next year. Hopefully things will be better then. We might be able to actually get people together in person. And we're going to consider that at our annual meeting week after next. But I do think that the more we can get these communities together and talking to each other and being more effective in affecting these things. Yes, posting comments is great. The GFC is posting comments. I don't know that the member states read every one of those comments. I don't, if there are a lot of them, it's just hard. So we have to go beyond that and actually have influence. And we can even convene, different groups can convene sessions with some of the member states. I think, doing things in New York where we have sessions with the diplomats that are there and the folks that are participating in this, I think could be very valuable. So I think we need to be creative in how we do this.
Thanks. I will add, if you allow me, actually, I will suggest something in order to get maybe more possibilities as governments discussing at the open-ended working group or the GGE to consider the inputs coming from civil society, from private sector, from academia. Of course, general statements, of course, general positions, of course, all what those sectors want help us in order to identify priorities at national, regional, and international level. Nevertheless, sometimes it's also important those sectors, because it's exactly as governments, we have many member states voices, then we have many private sector voices, we do have many civil society organizations voices and academia voices, etc. So sometimes it's good, it's helpful to see some statements or suggestions or additions to actually inputs put it on the table already. For instance, it will be helpful for the general processes to see how the civil society and the private sectors see the program of action, the proposal of program of action, how they see the proposal of international repositories on experiences, how they see the implementation review mechanism, if I may say, or the service, etc. I mean, if you go to the web page of the open-ended working group and also the secretariat and the chairs, both the open-ended working group chair and the GG have doing great, you will see how many different concrete proposals, more concrete proposals are already on the table. It will be good for the process in order to get something concrete, something substantive. Also, those sectors to say something on those proposals already on the table.
Thank you, Fabrizio. I'll turn it back to you for your closing thoughts on what the stakes are as we look ahead. What is the potential of digital technology to help fulfill the UN's agenda, and what leadership is needed from the UN in seeking to achieve this potential?
Thank you. I think the Secretary General likes to say that how we handle two issues will determine more than anything else what our future looks like. And one is, not surprisingly, climate change, but the second is the impact of digital technologies. And there's no question they can be a massive, we're seeing that already, a force for good, force for achieving the sustainable development goals, for leapfrogging in access to health, for leapfrogging in access to quality education, etc. But it's also clear, and the pandemic has brought that out, that if not adequately managed, if not adequately directed, and in some cases adequately regulated, they can further inequality, they can spread hate, they can undermine social cohesion. And it's also clear that the technologies have spread at a far greater pace than policymakers have been able to keep up. And that's true at most national levels, it's true at regional levels, And it's even truer at the international level. And these technologies, by definition, ignore borders. By definition, mean that you can sit in one place and cause harm or good in a place completely across the world. So we need greater international steerage. And at this time, where we're steering towards fragmentation of the internet, but partially because of the lack of international cooperation, because of the lack of international understanding, I think there's a certain urgency, notwithstanding the very fundamental areas which will always exist where we disagree, on doing much more to visibilize and articulate where we do agree, precisely to try and undercut the trend that is dominant now towards a sort of balkanization of the internet, which, if left to prevail, will do great harm in terms of our ability to overcome the digital divide and make the most out of this incredible technology.
Well, here we are. Thank you so much, Fabrizio Hochschild, Isaac Tenorio, Chris Painter, Raman China, and Kaya Siglich. It's been an absolute pleasure being your moderator today. And I hope you enjoy the rest of IGF 2020 and a massive, sorry, how can I forget, a massive, massive thank you to our highly engaged audience.
Thank you, Raj.
Thank you very much.
Moderating us.
Bye, everybody. Stay safe.
Thanks.
Thank you
Take
very
care,
much.
everyone. Bye.
See ya.
Thank you.
Bye.